Welcome back. Today we're going to examine in a little more detail the agricultural and economic situation in the South, the great importance of slavery, and the increased importance of cotton between 1800 and 1860 when the Civil War began. As I've mentioned in previous classes, the South was becoming a very distinctive region in the United States as the rest of the country, particularly the Northeast, began to industrialize. The South remained rural with an economy based almost exclusively on agriculture. There were very few large cities, very few immigrants, and very few factories. There were a few small industrial enterprises, but that was not the goal. The goal was large-scale agriculture. At the same time, there were relatively few financial institutions. The transportation infrastructure was very primitive compared to the North. As we've seen before, there were relatively few railroads in the southern states, and there were very few schools. The blacks were not allowed to receive an education, and the whites were dispersed on many plantations with small cities, and the wealthy planters could afford private tutors for their children. The tutors would often live with the family and tutor their children of all ages, and perhaps white children from nearby plantations would come in. But in terms of formal educational establishments, there were relatively few in the South throughout this period. As we've seen previously, climatic conditions favored plantation agriculture with the great heat and humidity, and this was particularly in the early years tobacco, indigo, rice, and sugar, and cotton became increasingly important after the invention of the cotton gin. Here we see a depiction of what many people think was antebellum or pre-war South. This is a large plantation. It's a cotton plantation. You can see in the lower left-hand part of the painting the white specks. Those are plants with cotton. If you look carefully, you can see slaves carrying large baskets of cotton. On the left, you also see the large plantation home, and you can see two steamboats in the photo carrying passengers, but mainly carrying cargo. While such large plantations certainly did exist, there were relatively few because most whites did not have slaves, and those that did had only a few. But this is the myth of the South that continues to this very day. Because of the large number of slaves, the South had what is generally regarded as a biracial culture. And white Southerners generally did not refer to slavery as slavery per se, but rather their peculiar institution. They claimed it was peculiar to the South, not only peculiar to the Southern economy, but the culture, the way of life. And for that reason, Northerners could not understand slavery. And for that reason, Southerners also maintained that Northerners were not in a position to criticize their peculiar institution. Even though most whites did not own slaves, because of the widespread belief in racial superiority of whites over blacks, the poor whites felt solidarity with the slaveholders. And it's interesting because the slaveholders and the wealthier, more educated whites looked down on the poor whites, referring to them as, quote, poor white trash. But all the whites had a shared belief in the racial inferiority of blacks. I might note that this belief in the racial superiority of whites, of Anglo-Saxons, was not unique to Southern slaveholders. This was the most widely held scientific belief at the time in the United States as well as Western Europe. And the South also had very few immigrants. There were few factories to draw the immigrants, and the immigrants certainly couldn't compete with slave labor. There was a real myth of Southern superiority that grew up in the South. It continued long after the Civil War, and some people say to a certain extent it extends to this very day. Southerners during the period we're studying believed that they were morally superior to Northerners. Southerners claimed that they treated the slaves better than the Northern factory owners treated their workers. They pointed out that the slaves had food, clothing, and shelter from birth to death, and they compared that to the situation in Northern factories, where when someone became too old and infirm to work, they simply lost their job and they were on their own, or if someone were injured on the job. But what grew up was the sense that it's not fair for Northerners to criticize Southerners because Northerners are ruthless with their own workers. Southerners also believed in the ideal of an agricultural society. It's no coincidence Thomas Jefferson, whom we looked at before, was a Southerner. And they had a real passion for hunting. People lived on farms in small towns. They would often hunt, not so much for sport, although that was done, but largely to acquire meat. They viewed themselves as expert horsemen. They could certainly ride horses very well, guns, and a strong military tradition. We will see at the outbreak of the Civil War that the Southern soldiers strongly believed that they were far superior to the Northern soldiers, and they used to say that one Southerner could kill easily 10 Yankees. They also viewed themselves, and this image continued long past the Civil War, that they were honest small farmers, and the large farmers, the plantation owners, were almost an aristocratic class. Their children were gentlemen, and their daughters were beautiful young Southern belles with gracious manners and beautiful dresses. And Southerners in general believed, particularly compared to Northerners, that they were much more honest, they were gracious, friendly, and more courageous in battle. And this is where Southerners prided themselves on the Southern hospitality, on friendliness, which, to my way of thinking, extends throughout the South today. I think generally most people would say you're in the South, people are generally in stores and whatnot friendlier than the North. And one of the reasons for this historically is the whites were living on farms, and so when travelers came, they were welcomed. There was no such thing really as a hotel in a small area, and they were welcomed, given dinner, and people were eager to talk to them to receive news of what was happening outside their small area. Cotton, around 1800, started to surpass all other plantation crops as the major agricultural product of the South. Compared to rice and sugarcane, cotton was relatively inexpensive to produce because both sugarcane and rice required expensive machinery on the plantations to process before shipping. Cotton required simply picking the white cotton from the plants, and then removing the seeds, and then packing it together in cotton bales and shipping it. Cotton was so profitable, it became known as, quote, white gold, and it was very, very much viewed that way and became the foundation of the economy of the southern states. And indeed, cotton was the largest export of the United States before the Civil War. We've already talked about the importance of technology in making cotton profitable. You had the cotton gin, which invented by Eli Whitney, as we've talked about previously, provided an inexpensive and quick means to remove the cotton seeds. And you also had machinery in New England, Britain, and elsewhere that could quickly and inexpensively convert cotton into textiles. And indeed, during the first industrial revolution, which is in the first part of the 1800s, textiles became by far the largest industry in the world. Southerners very much saw the need, from their perspective, to acquire additional land to grow cotton because cotton sucks many of the nutrients out of the soil and the soil becomes exhausted rather quickly. At this time, there was relatively little agricultural technology. There was no use of artificial fertilizers. They did understand that after planting cotton for a year or two, they should leave the soil for a planting season to let it replenish, but they certainly didn't have the artificial fertilizers that are available today, nor did they understand the value of planting nitrogen-fixing crops such as beans to bring nitrogen from the air into the soil. So the Southerners saw the need to expand across the Southwest to keep their economy going. And the Mississippi River was crucial for the Southern economy because that was known as the Cotton Highway to export cotton from the nearby states down to Port of New Orleans, where it would be shipped to New England, New York, Britain, France, and elsewhere. The cotton gin, as we've discussed previously, was a very simple mechanism, somewhat analogous to a comb that you use in your hair for removing the seeds from cotton. And the word gin comes from the word engine. The cotton gin greatly increased the demand for cotton because now cotton could be processed very, very quickly. So the net result was slaves were moved from household tasks, from working in gardens, and out into the fields to grow cotton. There was almost an insatiable demand for cotton by the textile industry because British cotton in particular was being produced and processed into textiles that were exported throughout the world. Here we see several slave women operating a mechanized cotton gin where the cotton comes in, and you can see the black specks there which represent seeds, and the cotton machine, which is in front of the woman on the right, has little teeth like somewhat similar to a comb, which will take the seeds out. And this particular cotton gin is turned by the wheel, which is connected to another wheel, which a horse or mule in the basement of the building is turning. So the men and the other female slaves are at this point out in the fields producing the cotton. The next few slides show the distribution of cotton and then slaves across the South. On this slide, these are the plantation economies in 1860, the outbreak of the Civil War. And you can see the areas there in light blue are all cotton producing areas, which extend throughout the South, through Louisiana and into Texas. And you can see the area where we are was a very rich and productive cotton producing area. In fact, most of this area around Katy, Houston, the majority of the population were slaves on plantations producing cotton. Here in Texas, you can see to the south of us near Lake Jackson area, more or less near Galveston, was sugar production. As you can also see in southern Louisiana, the area around New Orleans, a lot of sugarcane production. Moving to the east on the map, you can see Indigo, the dark purple there on the map, along the indigo and rice along the coast there. And then a little further north, the green area is the map, Virginia, and to the west, tobacco areas. And tobacco does not grow well in the high heat and humidity in the deep south or here where we are in Texas. So, but the takeaway in this should be cotton dominated the southern economy. On this slide, we see the percentage of slaves in the total population. The top map is 1820, the bottom map is 1860, and the dark red represents over 50% of the population being slaves. You can see in 1820 the large number of slaves in Virginia and North Carolina. This was tobacco production. And then to the south of that in South Carolina, producing largely rice and indigo. And then moving into the Louisiana area around New Orleans. Of course, in 1820, what is now Texas was belonged to Spain. It was part of the Spanish colony of what's now Mexico. The bottom slide in 1860, just before the Civil War broke out, you can see a high concentration of slaves remains in the Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina area. But what's significant is the movement of slaves, high concentration of slaves through the Cotton Belt. You can see that dark red area, orange area, moving across the southern states, Alabama, Mississippi, into Louisiana, and then down into Texas. As I mentioned, the expansion of cotton production greatly increased the demand for field slaves. This was not good news for slaves. The work in the cotton fields was much more difficult than work growing tobacco because cotton fields required more constant cultivation to remove the weeds. And also the climate in the deep south is hotter and more humid in the summer, which made the work outside all that more difficult. Because of the productivity and the great profitability of cotton production, slave owners would move slaves out of, for instance, the plantation garden growing lettuce and tomatoes and whatnot, and move them out growing cotton because they could make so much money growing cotton. The plantation owner could easily buy fruits and vegetables in the local market. The same thing goes for women female slaves who were traditionally involved often in weaving. They were now moved out into the fields. Of course, there were some slaves left working in the household, cooks and servants in the household and whatnot. But more and more of the slaves were moved out into the fields. There was also people in the north, slave owners in the north, would often sell their slaves and sell them to slaveholders in the south who would pay top dollar for the slaves. And this is when we really begin to see more and more breaking up of slave families because the slaveholders in the south wanted strong young men. They were not particularly interested in children or older slaves to work in the cotton fields. And so we have more and more slave families broken up. Also, the conditions on large cotton plantations were much more difficult because these were large plantations generally, so you didn't have the plantation owner out in the field himself supervising the management of the slaves, but the slaveholder would hire whites, poor whites, who would ride around on horses with a whip to keep the slaves working. And according to all accounts of former slaves, it was generally much more difficult to work for a white overseer than the slave owner himself, because the slave owner, while they were often cruel, generally would not want to whip a slave to death because the slaves represented a major investment in terms of money, where the white overseer was often very, very brutal. In fact, escaped slaves from the northern part of the South would often say their greatest fear was being sold down south. As we saw previously in the course, the legal importation of slaves ended in 1808, but there continued to be much smuggling, with around 300,000 slaves smuggled into the United States between 1808 and the Civil War. As I mentioned earlier in the lecture, the traditional image of the South as nothing but large plantations with many thousands of slaves on each plantation is really a myth. There were such plantations, but there were relatively few. In fact, less than 1/3 of Southern whites owned slaves. Put another way, 2/3 of the Southern whites did not own slaves. And those whites who owned slaves owned generally very small farms and had maximum of 2 or 3 slaves who would work out in the fields with the slave holders. And the majority of Southern whites were yeoman farmers. You recall yeoman farmers are small, word farmers is misspelled there, small farmers who just worked themselves and their family, perhaps hired a white person or perhaps 1 or 2 free blacks, but did not have slaves. Here we see a drawing of sort of a small family farm in which they have 3 or 4 slaves. You can see in the background the slaves, and in the foreground you can see the white men who are quite well dressed for doing work, and they are riding the horses, supervising. Obviously, they're having the slaves do the hot, dirty work, but the point is that the white slave owners are out in the fields with the slaves. The other extreme were the large plantations, large tobacco plantations, particularly cotton, which had many hundreds and sometimes thousands of slaves. Here we see a photograph, early photographs of the slave housing, and this is on a Sunday when the slaves didn't have to work all day, and the slave housing. You can see a good example of this slave housing in the Washington, D.C. area at George Washington's plantation home in Mount Vernon in Northern Virginia. And there you see the slave huts, which in that case are made of bricks, and it's fascinating to go through them because you can see how the slaves lived there. And George Washington, as we saw earlier in the course, was of course himself a major slaveholder. This slide shows cotton production in the United States in 1821. The next slide will look around 1860. Each dot represents 1,000 bales of cotton. A bale of cotton is 500 pounds of cotton. What they would do is take the cotton and it would be packed together, and they'd put rope or wire around it to transport it. And you can see, there was relatively little cotton production. It was more in Georgia, South Carolina, a little in Louisiana. Of course, in 1821, Texas was not independent yet, so we don't see any here. The next slide will show a significant difference. Here we see 1859, call it 1860, the beginning of the Civil War. Again, each dot represents 1,000 bales of cotton. You can see there are so many dots there in the deep South that they just all blur together. That's north of New Orleans, and particularly right along the Mississippi River. Many plantations there. One main reason was fertile soil, and also once the cotton was grown and packed, it could be easily transported to a boat on the Mississippi River and travel south. Looking into Texas, you can see the extensive cotton production in this area, although not as much as along the Mississippi River north of New Orleans. This is a slide just showing the bales of cotton. You can see these people are standing on top of the bales. This goes on for almost a mile. This is cotton waiting shipment. And if you look at it in the foreground, you can see the pieces of wire that hold the cotton together. Each one of these bales of cotton is 500 pounds. This photo is taken a little after the Civil War because we have steamships in the background, but it gives you an idea of the amount of cotton production. Looking briefly at the situation of the whites in the Old South, South before the Civil War, and that's often referred to as the antebellum South, Antebellum. Antebellum in Latin means before the war, so that's pre-Civil War South. And the society, the white society in the South was really dominated by the social and economic elite of the planters and the merchants who were engaged in trading cotton, tobacco, whatnot, importing food and manufactured goods. They really dominated society. And it wasn't that way so much in the North. In the North, in a sense, it was much more open society, not totally open, but much more open society than in the South. And as I mentioned previously, the large planters, those who owned more than 20 slaves, considered the poor whites quote, poor white trash. They said they were poorly educated, they weren't refined like they were. Yet all the whites identified as being superior to the blacks, so it gave them a sense of social solidarity. And 40% of the whites owned no land, so they worked for others. Some of them worked for other whites who owned no slaves, or in fact, some of the whites without land worked for planters who owned a few slaves and then also had a few whites working along with the slaves in the fields. And then, of course, other whites worked in the small cities, in stores or, in stables taking care of horses and whatnot. Turning to black culture, around 5% or 10% of the blacks were not slaves. There were free blacks. We'll talk about them in a minute. But of the vast majority of blacks in the South were slaves, and most worked in the fields. A few of them worked doing skilled work on the plantation, working as carpenters or whatnot, and some worked in the house, particularly females, as cooks or servants. There was a great increase in the number of slaves during this period, largely due to the profitability of King Cotton. In 1790, there were about 700,000 slaves. By 1860, that number was in excess of 4 million. So this is an incredible increase in the number of slaves in less than 100 years. The states had slave codes, which we'll talk about more later in the course. The slave codes were designed to regulate the movement and conduct of the slaves. And the free blacks, in contrast to the slaves, could enter into contracts legally. They could marry legally. Slaves could not. The free blacks could own property, and in fact, a few free blacks even owned black slaves themselves. And they could also pass property to their children. In other words, their children could inherit property. Many of these free blacks became skilled workers, particularly in carpentry, blacksmith, and whatnot. And many of the free blacks were mulattoes. That is, they were of mixed race, usually a white father or grandfather with black mother or grandmother. And This caused a problem for the whites in the South. They weren't quite sure often how to treat the mulattoes, and so meant, a good number of them were free blacks. We see here the medallion that was worn by free blacks in the city of Charleston to indicate that they were not a slave. Each one was numbered. In practice, people did not travel much beyond where they lived at that time. This includes blacks, free blacks, as well as whites. The transportation network was not very good. So in practice, most people knew the free blacks in the area. They'd say, oh, that's Joe, or Bill, or something like that. So they didn't have to constantly show their medallion. But if in fact they were traveling out of their immediate area, they would want to show that they weren't an escaped slave. From 1800 to 1860, the price of slaves quadrupled, and this was largely due to the profitability of cotton. As we saw before, in 1808, the importation of the slaves was no longer legal, although there was smuggling. But if you're buying a smuggled slave, the price would be more than it would have been before the ban on the importation. And slaves were much more profitable as economic assets because of the price of cotton increased. Another way to increase the number of slaves was to breed them, just as farmers then and today breed cattle. Strong, young male slaves were often required to sleep with a different slave woman every night on a large plantation, or actually lent out to other slaveholders with the idea that their children, the slave children, would be strong. And obviously they couldn't do any work as a baby, but as they grew up, they were considered an economic asset. And there were a good number of people whose job was breeding slaves or selling slaves. Slaves were economic assets for the slaveholders, and if someone had an excess number of slaves, they would sell them and try and make a profit. And there were obviously people involved in the buying and selling of slaves. Particularly with the great increase in cotton production, families were broken up in most states. Some states this did not happen as much. It depended on the local conditions, but this was one of the greatest horrors of slavery. And I already talked previously about on the large plantations, the field hands were not supervised directly by the owner, but a white overseer or a black driver. A black driver was a trusted slave, trusted by the whites, who said, well, you can then drive the fellow slaves, and in return received additional privileges, such as more food or a nicer place to live. Here we have the slave population in 1820. We saw a similar slide previously. Again, it's centered along the Atlantic Ocean. And by 1860, it spread out much, much more through the Cotton Belt. The greatest fear of whites was slave rebellion. Because you look at a plantation, particularly a larger plantation, there are dozens or hundreds of slaves, and the white slave owner, his wife, family, perhaps a few other white workers, and they could easily be overtaken and killed by the slaves. So they were terrified of rebellions. There were a number of rebellions in the South, and every time there was a slave rebellion, the slave codes became harsher and harsher. The whites were also terrified by what had happened in the French colony, which is now called Haiti, in the Caribbean, where in the 1790 the slaves had rebelled. They had been put down by the French with great violence, but in 1804 the slaves managed to overthrow The French killed many of the white planters, and Haiti became independent in 1804, and it was ruled by former black slaves. Now, the whites did not want the slaves to know about this. This was one of the reasons that they didn't want the slaves to learn to read and write, because they might read in the newspaper about what was happening in Haiti or elsewhere. And of course, another reason they did not want the slaves to be able to read or write, they didn't want them to be able to pass notes to slaves on neighboring plantations to join together in a slave uprising. The whites' worst fears were realized in 1831 in Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia, which created panic among all Southern whites, not just slaveholders, but all the Southern whites. What happened was Nat Turner was a trusted slave. In fact, he was one of these slave drivers or slave overseers whom the white master thought was very loyal to him. Well, Nat Turner organized a rebellion in which slaves from Nat Turner's plantation where he worked and neighboring plantations killed 57 white people, and most of those killed were women and children. Well, Nat Turner and the other slaves were captured, executed, but this led to much harder slave codes. And there were a number of other slave rebellions before this and after it. Nat Turner's was the biggest. And so the net result was, up until the Civil War, the great fear was a slave rebellion. And we'll see in the 1850s, there's real horror in the South when a white man, John Brown, attempts to steal weapons to distribute to slaves. So again, all the whites in the South, not just the slaveholders, lived in constant fear of a slave rebellion, with the result that the conditions for the slaves became more and more difficult. Thank you very much.